Well, last week, if you were with us, then you know that we finished our message series in First Thessalonians. And Second Thessalonians is what comes after that in order in the Bible, and also is probably the next book of the New Testament that was written, but it's not what we're going to be starting today. Even though thematically it is also very closely tied, I still wanted to put some distance in between, kind of allow it to build up, I guess, percolate, and instead of going straight into that, move back to the Old Testament, since that's generally what we do here, is go back and forth between the Testaments. And so today we're going to be starting a new series in the book of Joshua, which does still tie in very well, just first of all, actually, to our kind of circumstances here at Potters, because we're in the process, as you know, of trying to figure out what we're going to do next as far as a location, and just trying to give some thought to what we can find in order to pursue the next steps that the Lord has for us as we continue to look for growth and opportunities to experience that and be reaching out to the people around us. But even more than that, Joshua ties into our eternal home. And that was what the experience of the Israelites recorded here was pointing to, which of course is what First Thessalonians was promising, that the Lord is giving us a home and we have to take it. And so today we're going to look at the start of that effort, and especially at what was required of the man leading it for the lessons that it teaches us about recognizing whose lead to actually follow. God is with us, and He will deliver everything that He has promised. And so we have to take courage from His presence and have the faith to move where He sends us. So we will be in Joshua chapter 1, and if you want to find your way there in your Bibles or grab one of the Bibles that we have over there, pull out your phone to do that, you can go ahead now. But before actually making our way into the text of the book, I just want to start, as we usually do, by providing kind of an overview of the whole thing and where it comes from. Actually starting with why we're looking at Joshua at all, because if you have been following along, then you know that the last full book of the Old Testament we looked at, because we did do a few in the Psalms, but the last one we looked at completely was Numbers, and Joshua doesn't come right after Numbers. Deuteronomy is in between. But we're not going to be looking at Deuteronomy because it does go over a lot of the same things that were in books that we have looked at, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And since it's repetitive, we're skipping it for now. Now, it still has a lot of valuable things in it that we do want to look at. It's just, I figure it'll be good to come back to it for reminders when we have gone a bit further in the Old Testament. So that's why we're going into Joshua, moving forward with the narrative of the Old Testament today. As for who wrote Joshua and when, we don't know. It's not Joshua, for one thing, and we're never told anywhere, either in the book or elsewhere in Scripture, who was the person who did this. It's just anonymous, and as for even when it was written, there's a pretty big window on that. Now, I think we probably can go ahead and say somewhere within the about 400 years after the events that are described here. Just on the basis of a few pieces of evidence that are inside the book itself. There's some vocabulary that's used that's pretty ancient for the Hebrew language and that wasn't used during later periods of time. There's mention, as we'll see, of certain landmarks that are talked about and said, and it's still there to this day. You can go and check. By a later time in Israelite history, those things weren't there anymore, so you couldn't go and check anymore. So that means whoever wrote them was seeing them at an earlier period of time to be able to say that. And then there's also just some, I guess the shorthand way to say it is there are some societal assumptions that don't really fit into later Israelite history. And so all of that says that probably would have been before the reign of David that this was written. Now, as for when these events were occurring and where, that's a little bit easier. And for the where, I actually have a map to be able to see the general region, which is modern day. This is roughly where the modern nation of Israel is. And so this is the land that they were going to. And this would have happened at the end of the Exodus. It's the very next thing that occurs. So that puts it, like I was talking about, that would be 400 years before the reign of King David. And David lived 1,000 years before the ministry of Jesus, and Jesus was living and working 2,000 years ago. And so the events that we're looking at take place 3,400 years before us. And this was an important time in that area of the world because there was a lot of upheaval going on. This area on the Mediterranean coast is a very important crossroads and was at that time, and it was a point of contact and conflict for a number of empires that were very powerful in that era. But in this particular time, they were all on the decline. And so they all still had kind of a presence there, but they didn't have outright control of it anymore. And so it created a window of opportunity where Israel was really only going to have to deal with the locals who were there. And so the Lord, in his providence, made that happen as well to give them an opening. The last thing to mention in this regard, just for the overview, is when you talk about who wrote a book, you usually also talk about who they wrote the book to. If we don't know who did it, then we can't say that exactly either, but we don't need to, because it was written to Israel in general. It was for all of their generations to be able to look back and see what God had done in order to give them their homeland. And then that also is, of course, why it is important to Christians as well, just because it's a lesson in showing God's faithfulness to his promises, which then calls his people to be faithful to him in return. So that's really what Joshua is about. And so it's with that in mind that we can go ahead and actually look at some of the verses here in chapter 1, starting with verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon I have given you, as I said to Moses, from the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. All the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. So the book of Joshua starts with the death of Moses, and this was a seismic shift for the nation of Israel. Moses was the one who had brought them out of slavery in Egypt. He was the one who led them through the wilderness for 40 years. Of course, the 40 years was not because they were lost that entire time. It was because the people of Israel refused to go into the promised land the first time when God told them to, and so at that point he said, fine, none of you are getting in ever then. And he punished them with that wandering so that that first generation would all pass away. Which meant that the generation that exists there now, the second one that's getting ready to go in, all that they had known for their entire lives had been the leadership of Moses. And so this was a huge change for them. He was the one who had established their civil and religious society. And more important than anything else, he was, as he's called here, the servant of the Lord. Here and a lot of other places actually in this book, Moses is called the servant of the Lord, and because he had been the intermediary between God and Israel with a special closeness to the Lord that was unseen in anyone else. That's what the Lord actually says himself in Numbers chapter 12, verses 6 to 8. Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, and not in dark sayings. And he sees the form of the Lord. And so Moses was an incredible figure, but now he's gone. And he's gone because not even he was perfect. He failed to obey and sanctify God one time, but that was enough to make it so that he was not allowed into the promised land either. And he died outside of its borders, right on its border. In spite of that, of course, there's no question, he was going to be missed. And he was going to leave very difficult shoes to fill, but Joshua would have to try. He was at least as qualified as anyone could hope to be. He had been and was the general of Israel, the leader of its fighting forces, and he was Moses' assistant, his closest helper. He'd even actually been on Mount Sinai with Moses when Moses received the law from the Lord, not the whole way up the mountain, but he was waiting for him part way. And as a result of that, he wasn't in the camp when the rest of the Israelites at the base of the mountain were rebelling against God with the golden calf and that whole incident that they caused, because Joshua would have certainly stood against them if he had been there. He just didn't realize what was going on. In fact, Joshua, there's never a point where he engaged in one of the rebellions of Israel. The most important one of those would have been, again, that refusal to enter the promised land. Joshua had been one of 12 spies that Moses had sent in to scout it out first. And 10 of those spies came back and told everybody that the land is full of monsters, basically, and we're never going to be able to do this, and convinced everyone else not to go. But 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, no, let's go. Let's go into the promised land because God is on our side and we will be able to win. And so because those 2 were faithful, they were told that they would survive. They would be the only ones left from that first generation, but they would actually see God's promise fulfilled and they would go into the promised land. And so that's why he is here for this now. But again, just like really with Moses, he was the right person for the job because he was the Lord's choice. God had selected him and placed his spirit upon him. And Numbers 27 talks about that. And God made it clear that he was the man for the job. That was the only qualification that mattered. But it is still a very difficult situation that he's going into here. This mission that he's going to be on, what the whole book is about, this great shift in Israel's situation, is that they are going from wandering the wilderness to possessing the promised land. And this is a truly daunting project. The land is large, for one thing. These are people who were, again, raised by people who had been slaves beforehand and who had the land they had from their slave masters. Now they're having to go take a homeland of their own. And it's not like it was empty. There are people living there at the time, and so they're going to have to fight them. But probably the thing that would have had Joshua more nervous than anything else is that he has to try to corral Israel. That always proved to be difficult for Moses. They were constantly rebelling, and it led them astray. And Joshua knows that he is no Moses. And so he is. It appears that there is some fear, which he had every reason for in the situation that he is up against. But God wants to encourage him that he can face these things. And so that is what he says to him next in Joshua chapter 1, starting from verse 5. He says, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it, to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Joshua was no Moses. He didn't have to be. This passage, especially verses 5 and 9, they outright say it. The Lord was with him. That is all that he needed, was to look to God for leadership. It's going to be the constant throughout this book. It's really not about what Joshua does, even though it's named after him. It's about what God does, which was the exact same thing for Moses. It was really God who had freed the Israelites from Egypt. God who had brought them and provided for them through the wilderness. God now who was going to give them this land. Now actually, verse 3, if you peek back there from the previous passage that we read, it puts it in the past tense. This is something that's already done. It's as good as done as far as God is concerned. They just have to reach out and take it at his invitation. Nothing can stop him. So nothing can stop them if they're with him. And so this is to encourage Joshua. He had to have been dealing with doubts about himself and about this effort. But so God told him these things to give him the right perspective, a perspective that we still need too. We're not going to find strength in ourselves. If that's where we look for it, then we're going to be ruled by fear. Because we're going to see that we don't actually have anything that makes us capable of doing all the things that are needed, especially when it comes to salvation. So courage then is found in just relying on the Lord and what He is giving us, which of course then we are supposed to live from, as the Lord tells Joshua here. He ties his success to his obedience by being obedient to what was handed down by Moses. From those things, he knew what was expected of him, and so he needed to constantly remind himself of those things and then believe God thoroughly enough in order to do those things. Because this is something that it feels like it should be obvious to people, but it's not. But God's way is right and good. And so, experiencing goodness requires going His way. If you go in any other direction, if God's good and you're going in any other direction, then what's it leading to? It's to bad. To things that you're not going to want in the end. Taking another road is disastrous, and that's by definition, since God defines what goodness is. We have to be approaching Him. Well, and doing that, you have to know what it actually depends on to be able to approach Him. And so this is a good moment to just be reminded of what the name Joshua means. His name originally was Hosea, and that means salvation. But Moses changed it. He changed it to Joshua, which means the Lord's salvation. And it's actually the first name in the Bible that incorporates God's personal name, Yahweh, the meaning of which was given to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. And so Moses did this in order for it to stand as a reminder of where salvation actually comes from, because he knew that Joshua was a soldier, and he probably had some idea that Joshua was going to be really important in taking the promised land. And so he wanted everybody to know, well, no, he's not the one who's making this possible, the Lord is. And the reason why that matters so much is because the name Joshua became fairly popular throughout Israelite and then later Jewish history. And most importantly, it was the name given to the Son of God when He was born among us. It was, of course, for us, we translate that Jesus because that's on the basis of the Greek form of the name, but Joshua is where that actually comes from. Jesus, who is the Lord's salvation. That's who we have to look to, because none of us actually does do what Joshua is told to do here. None of us keeps the whole direction of God without making a wrong turn at one point or another, or really over and over. We are powerless to save ourselves. So the only necessary and sufficient thing that we can do to actually obey God is to be in the one who was perfectly obedient, which is what Christ was. But then He suffered. In spite of not deserving it, He paid the price for our failures, bearing them on the cross, leaving them nailed there when He died, and then offering us life when He rose, so that we can be with Him, so that we can have that home. So our courage should come from knowing that this is actually on His shoulders, and He was able to carry it. It's as good as done as a result. Then we live out of that. We need to do what Joshua is told to do here and stay in the whole Word in order to know what is best, in order to be continually approaching God, in order to follow the Holy Spirit and put all of this in practice. We need to actually be returning to the things that God has delivered to us, what He has said about Himself and what He wants from us, and to do those things, but all the while knowing it is Christ who takes us home. Now, the homeward movement for Israel does continue a bit further in Joshua chapter 1, and so just a few more verses to read from there. Starting in verse 10, Joshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, "Pass through the camp and command the people, saying, prepare provisions for yourself. For within 3 days you will cross over this Jordan to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess." And then down to verse 16. So they answered Joshua, saying, "All that you command us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, so we will heed you. Only the Lord your God be with you, as He was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your command and does not heed your words, in all that you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and of good courage." So Joshua, here we see him making his first act of leadership, which is actually to obey. to follow God's leadership. He had received the command to move out, and so he gives Israel the command to move out, which is what all good servant leaders do. They hear the words of God, and then they make those words known to others so that they can follow them also. But Israel, we are told, they listened. They listened to Joshua. They made the promise that they would continue to listen to Joshua. And then they close with their own note of encouragement, which is interesting because it's pretty much the same thing that God had said to Joshua, but it actually means something different. God says to have courage in Him, to lean on Him because He's the source of goodness and strength. He's the one who's actually able to provide it. He's the source of what we need. And so that's why Joshua is supposed to have faith and take his courage from that. The Israelites ask Joshua to have courage for them, which is not a bad thing. It's the recognition that they needed each other, that they were going to support him so that he could uplift them, so that he could take the lead in gaining control of the promised land. And this is what it continues to mean to be the people of God. We are supposed to share this with one another, to remind each other that He is with us. He's the one giving us what we need, and so we need to be joined together in actually pursuing Him, sharing that encouragement so that we can experience this, knowing that we are a family, a nation, that we are the assembly, the church of God, united by Him, and so we ought to be standing together. Now, if you want to be a part of that and you're not already, then you need to actually take what God has given. So whether this is for somebody here or maybe somebody who's watching this later on online, I hope that you can recognize, even from the things that we've looked at from here in Joshua, the way that they already point to Jesus. That you can only find salvation by trusting in the one who is God's salvation, what He did in His death and in His resurrection. And for some people, I know they don't feel like they need to be forgiven. But if you think that you have your own system worked out with God, you need to understand that you don't. That you're lying to yourself and that you are moving in a direction that is away from Him, because Christ is the only one that He has established for this. And then maybe going in the opposite extreme, there are some people who think that they are so bad that they can never be forgiven. You're wrong about that too, because no one is. Christ's sacrifice was infinite. It was a greater price to pay than any debt that could possibly exist. And He gave that out of love for you. I hope that you can hear that, really know that, take hold of it. Because if you do, you'll no longer have to be afraid. But for those of you who are Christians, we know also that life does remain full of challenges. Things that we have to go up against that we can very often be frightened of. But we can meet them in God's strength. And remember that Jesus renewed the Lord's promise to Joshua to all of us with what He said in Matthew 28, verse 20. Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. That is His promise, that we have a home with Him, that we are safe in Him. And the benefit that we have, kind of over against the experience of Israel that we'll be looking at through this book, is that we don't have to kick anybody out to take our home. Instead, we're supposed to be inviting them in. So do that and encourage one another to go out and do so, to share the good news of Jesus, the Lord's salvation.